R.W. Johnson, political scientist, author, historian, and the most popular columnist on BizNews Premium, is with us this morning to pick up on two columns that he wrote in the past week that have been, well, thoughtful as always, but even more popular than usual. Morning, Mr. Johnson. Lovely to be talking with you again. Let's pick up with the first one, which was to remind us that Johannesburg is one of the few major global cities that is not built near a source of plentiful water. And now that the gold is gone, the reason why it started in the first place, it got me thinking, and maybe there are some parallels here. In the United States, in particular, there are many of these ghost towns where there were gold rushes. People went to the ghost towns, mined out whatever gold was there, and then the once thriving community dissipated. I guess on a much broader scale, that might be something that could happen to Johannesburg.
Well, it's an awesome thought because Johannesburg is the biggest city, and it's not just what's inside Johannesburg, but all around that too. So that as a conurbation, it's very, very big. And people are still going there in large numbers from abroad. If you look at the figures, it's actually been adding people in the recent period more than the Western Cape because of that historic migratory pattern, which is still there. So that there are still lots of people in Malawi and Zimbabwe and elsewhere whose idea is that you go to Joburg, and so they're still piling in, but certainly there is a big migratory flow out now, and it's mainly coming to the Western Cape or emigrating.
So the whole story about not being on a plentiful source of water, are there other cities around the world that have managed to sustain themselves despite that that drawback or that problem?
I don't know because I'm not well enough informed on that. I'm afraid, but I don't know of any. Every city that I know has got a large river running through it, whether it's the Thames or the Hudson or, you can go through even much smaller cities there which have a river.
And you mentioned in your column, in this particular column, the conversation that you had with one of your former students. It's worth elaborating on that.
He was very bright man, and I was pleased to see him, but I was rather surprised that his take was that the cities are in the wrong place, and that really it ought to be more like Australia, where all the major towns are on the coast, and the interior is fairly empty because it's so dry and also too hot. And he said, you ought to be much more like that. And things that don't need to be in Joburg or Pretoria should be relocated or should relocate. And it just struck me that maybe some of that is now happening, but for other reasons. The truth is that when you get a large city, which has been there for quite a long time now, well over a century, that people feel very settled. They get to be very fond of their environment, and the idea of moving away is anathema to them, in the first place. But nonetheless, it is happening now to a more and more pronounced degree. But as I say, the reason they're moving is, well, I don't suppose it is water related yet, although I think that could become a major source of migration because these water cutoffs are probably with us now for some time to come, and are likely to be a recurring feature in Joburg, I think. But because the basic reasons for it are power cuts, and that's not going to stop. So, and the water boards are not going to be better run than they were before. So, that's likely to be the case. But I do think that most of the migration now is a sort of getting away from the ANC and what that means in terms of municipal dislocation of all sorts, with all the things going wrong that we know about.
It's an interesting thought that when we have the 2024 election, there will be, by all the polls and by all accounts, a different governing party in Gauteng, which would presume that there might be more support for the Johannesburg Council, etc. And let's just say it was a non-ANC run metro. Would it be possible for them to turn things away, given the ANC's poor record on maintenance, etc.?
Well, we've had that experience, haven't we, with the DA mayor and council for a while. And the poor mayor, she said, Johannesburg is in ruin. And that was the phrase she used repeatedly. And she said, it's terribly sad to say so, but that is the situation. And I think that is the situation which would face a DA or whatever opposition coalition might emerge, because the problem is twofold. One is that this has been going on for the best part of 30 years, this neglect and mismanagement and so on. That means there's a huge accumulated backlog of things in all areas. And secondly, it means that the administration, the actual people who work for you in the city hall, will pretty well all be deployed cadres. And so you've got a real problem there because, this is something which the DA faced in Cape Town and has faced in other places as well, where they come in and they face that. And, getting that sorted out takes time. So, it's a very, very large job if you're going to try to turn things around, because you've got to, well, what they did in Cape Town and I think elsewhere was to say, look, everybody, we're perfectly happy for you to do your job. We realize that you've been waiting for an ANC administration till now. This is going to be different, but we are very happy to work with you. But if people don't do their jobs, then we will have to change things. And of course, they did find then that there were some people who carried on carrying out ANC policies, which they had now reversed, and they would call them in and, the usual things with a letter of warning and so forth. And finally, they would get rid of them and they would gradually, if necessary, replace. But they didn't have to do it on a very large scale because most people were happy enough in Cape Town to say, okay, fine, we'll just do our jobs. We want to keep our jobs. And, so they kept most of those people. So, and it's worked. So that's fine. But usually at the top level, the city manager and that sort of thing are people. I mean, in Cape Town, he was just an ANC cadre who carried on. Said, that's what I do. And, you got to change that sort of thing. And they have to get rid of it. And I don't know the situation in Joburg, but I assume it's the same.
So you'd have at the top the cadres who probably would be replaced, but for the majority of people, there's a big job that awaits them. And on top of that, you've got the water issue down the line. The other column that you wrote is an interesting one, because we've had quite a lot on BizNews this past week about socialism. The interview that I had with Anthea Jeffrey about her new book on the Countdown to Socialism, it's called, where she references the National Democratic Revolution as something that was devised in Moscow in the 1950s. And the whole driver towards, or the fixation that the ANC has with this and how it is affecting the economy, etc. Now, when you wrote How Long Has South Africa, or How Long Will South Africa Survive a few years ago, that was a bestseller on a similar theme where the financial situation of the country was just not being properly understood. And you revisited that in this most recent column. And again, to remind us that we aren't making too much progress on that front.
No. And in fact, look, we are now again pushing up against the limits of how much we can borrow. And in effect, this primary budget surplus idea is always wheeled out, but it's not the reality. I mean, it excludes interest on the debt, which is now a very large item in the budget. And, if we're going to, when it comes to actual having to borrow, that is one of the reasons why you borrow, is that you've got to pay that debt interest. And it's going to be going up because of rising interest rates too, so that it'll become a larger and larger item. But no, I mean, the implication is that, look, we could get out of this two ways. One is by absolute austerity, where you cut a lot of the social spending of one sort or another, and it would be politically very difficult to do. But the other way, of course, the much nicer way, would be to have real economic growth. If we were growing even at 2.5% or 3%, that would be something. I mean, all these years we've had, 0 point something growth, or none at all. And we're still growing at that sort of level. And that means it's not keeping up with population growth. So that means that per capita income is steadily falling. It's been falling for over a decade. And to be quite frank, I don't know, irrespective of what political system you have, in any country in the world where per capita income steadily falls, you're going to have trouble politically, because, at a certain point there will be a revolt against the situation. And that's just a fact. But, the ANC has just carried on with its policies and not taken those signals at all, which are that they need, any government in this country ought to be absolutely flat out to create growth. I was noticing that Keir Starmer has now said that's the number one objective of the Labour Party, is more economic growth. We want to be the fastest growing member of the G7. That would take a lot, because Britain is not growing very well at all at the moment. It's very slow. And, they'll have to make major changes if he's really going to live up to that. But I think that ought to be the objective here. And of course, that would then gradually make the payment on, and of course, if at the same time you did everything you could to hold down further debt, then you would gradually get to a situation where you could start repaying some of this debt, and where it would shrink as an item in your budget, which is what we want to happen. But otherwise, we are on course ultimately for IMF bailout. And, that's the moment of truth ahead if they carry on.
Now, it's extraordinary, that story that or the mention that you had on the primary budget deficit. It's way a little bit like when people talk about load shedding. It's lovely words, but completely irrational, because 18% of South Africa's costs are interest repayments. So if you are saying, well, we aren't spending more than the taxes that we're getting in, excluding the 18%, you're really fooling yourself. But when you look at what's happened over the past few years and the commodities boom that seems now to have petered out, does that not exaggerate the problems that might be faced?
Oh, indeed. And indeed, the slow growth and the problems of transport, where we've seen how, already mining companies cutting back on production simply because they can't ship the ore or the finished metal away from where they are, because the railways are not working. So that when you're cutting production for whatever reason, that means that your turnover and your taxes paid are going to be much less. So, that's now beginning to hit the fiscus quite seriously.
What is this fixation by the ANC on taking blueprints from outside the country, and perhaps you could apply your mind to the two of them. The National Democratic Revolution, as Anthea writes very or articulates very well in her book, was created in the Soviet Union, which itself imploded in the 1950s, which is nearly 75 years ago. And then the second thing is the labor policies in South Africa were inherited from West Germany, which is hardly a good model for a developing country. And yet it's almost like the ANC-SACP take in these policies and drive them no matter what the evidence is showing. Where does this come from?
Well, it comes from historic commitments which they made, and basically the SACP was pushing the National Democratic Revolution, and they got them to accept it because they didn't have a plan otherwise, and that was, what they'd accepted for some time to come. The oddity is, of course, that the authors who actually wrote about it in the Soviet Union and sort of put it forward as a model have now themselves said it's a lot of nonsense and it didn't work, and we wish to completely distance ourselves from that because it was just a load of fantasy. So, we are following not only an outdated model, but one which its authors long since sort of abandoned. So it's a very strange thing to do. I have to say that I haven't read Anthea's book yet. I look forward to doing so. But I suppose my own emphasis is different because if you look at the realities, it's difficult to say that we are either a socialist state fully, or that things are moving in that direction, because they're not. Obviously they've been trying to do that, but it's not working. And the result is they're having to bring in private people in Transnet, and there's been this proliferation of other energy sources because of the failures of Eskom. I mean, a great deal. I mean, very large numbers of people and companies have invested in solar and other means of powering themselves, and that's clearly going to continue. So that, that's already a sort of semi-privatization effect going on. And I think that's just going to happen,
I asked her about that, and her response was, well, with the National Democratic Revolution, you take a step backwards sometimes to go 2 steps forward. So the way she says is watch out, because when you get things right, the SACP, ANC will do what they've always promised to do, which is to nationalize and turn the country into a socialist state. I guess that all lies in the future, and we don't know how that's going to work out, but it is something to be concerned about, no doubt.
Oh, it is, except that it's clearly not going. That things are breaking down at a much higher rate than they are progressing towards that sort of future. And, that's going to force, already, as you know, in Joburg, quite a lot of municipal services, like filling potholes and things, are being done by the private sector, actually. And, they're just doing it as a matter of goodwill. And I think that is already the situation. Certainly wherever there's a large mine, they are running the whole municipal area. And, we're moving away from that on the ground. But she's right that, of course, that remains the model and what they would like to do. But I don't think they're ever going to get to the point where it's possible, But, of course, the problem about it is that while that remains the model which you're moving towards, that it's, and you've got that in your head, that you're not going to start doing the things that you need to do to remove obstacles to growth. I mean, it's quite clear, and has been for some time, that Eskom, Transnet in particular, but certainly other publicly owned things as well, really are holding the economy back. And that if you could just privatize them or fix them completely, that you would release quite a lot of growth, without a doubt. I mean, if Transnet was working properly, the ports and the railways were all working in the way they used to, then we would be exporting a lot more from the mines for a start. So, but probably more fruit and agricultural products as well, actually. So that that alone would help things considerably.
R.W. Johnson, political scientist, author and historian, and I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.